Welcome to another session in the studio, and it's time for art. Today we are learning some basic weaving techniques. In the classroom you're learning about the Navajo, the Dene, and their weaving tradition. And I'm going to show you three different techniques: the basic Tabby Weave, dovetailing, and vertical bars, three of my favorite weaving techniques. So let's get started. Before we get started with our weaving techniques, let's review some of our vocabulary terms. This is a cardboard loom, and the threads that go straight up and down on the loom are our warp threads, and the ones that we weave from left to right are the weft yarns or weft threads. This is what we call our shed. That helps us to weave, and it also helps us to stand up our warp threads so that we can weave more easily as things get tighter. And these are loaded shuttles. These are our shuttles, and they hold the weft threads and are very useful in keeping our weft threads from getting tangled. But once we get down to smaller, tighter areas, we have to put our weft threads on a needle so that we can weave more easily. So let's start with the basic Tabby Weave. And the way the Tabby Weave works is you use your weft threads to go from left to right, over and under one warp thread at a time. So I've done quite a bit of Tabby Weave here, and I want to look to see where I left off. And I left off with this first warp thread where the weft thread is going over it and then under the second one. So now I'm going to alternate that and go under, then over. So I'm doing the exact opposite of what I did when I passed from right to left. Now my warp threads are going to be coming back from left to right. And as you can see, I can barely stand this up, but I'm going to just work my needle through there. And on this next pass, I'm going to just use my shed, as I like to, just underneath all of the warp threads. Makes it much easier when you're working with the needle to just stand all those warp threads up together. Now, when I get to the end, I do not want to choke my warp threads. I want to make sure that they are nice and even. So what I like to do is slow down, hold on to my weft thread and my last warp thread, pull it gently, and make a little arch out of these yarns, and then just use my fingers to tap them down. We don't ever want to choke our warp threads. Makes it very challenging to continue weaving. Now the next thing I'd like to show you is how to do what we call the dovetail. You can make geometric shapes like triangles and squares and zigzags and even circles. But when you do that, you see how I've dropped warp threads to get that triangular wedge going on there. So when we fill in the rest of the warp threads with a second contrasting color, we need to dovetail them where they meet, and that means to interlock them around the same warp threads. So we have to pay close attention to what it is we're doing. We're going under, then over, then under, then over, then under and over. And now when I get to this first color that I wove, I want to wrap my blue yarn around the same warp thread, but I have to separate this row from that row. So I'm going over and then under that same warp thread, and then basically I have to turn around, come back to the outside edge, and so now my yarn is going to go over that first warp thread, then under, over, under, over, under, and finish by going over. And again, you don't want to choke, so you want to hold that. Don't pull it too hard. Now, when I go back, I'm going to separate this row and that row. And again, I'm going to here and then going under, and then turning around and jumping over that warp thread. Again, you can hold your yarn, your weft and your warp, so that as you pull, you're not choking. And then I'm going to come back the opposite of what I went in with. Again, don't pull it real hard, just pull it gently, and then we're going to separate the next row, and you see how this next row dropped this warp thread and just wove around this warp thread twice. So that'll increase our going here. We want to stop just before that because now we've got to go over and then turn around and come under that warp thread. We want to make sure we're not messing this up. So we want to separate that row from the other row, go over and then under, and now over, under, over, under, over, under, and finish with over. Sometimes you run out of yarn before you're done weaving, so the simplest way to add yarn is to cut the amount that you think you might need, And then take the two ends, the end of the yarn you're working with and the new yarn, put them together, make them one strand, and tie a knot like that. Slide that knot down to about 1 to 1/2 inch to the ends and pull it tight. And just continue weaving. When you put your yarn on the needle, it's challenging to try and get that yarn into there that way. So I like to kind of fold it in half like that and just push it through, and that way your ends don't get frayed and you don't have a mess on your hands. Now that I've reached the end of my dovetailing, to finish this off, I don't necessarily want to tie that in a knot, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to push that needle to the back of my weaving, and trim it off, leaving about a 1-inch tail. And then I'll just push that to the back where no one sees it. Now, this is where I tied that double knot to add more yarn. Again, all I'm going to do is push that knot to the back where no one has to see it. And then I can scrunch down my weaving, tighten that up. And there's the dovetailing technique finished. The third technique of weaving that I'd like to demonstrate here today is called vertical bars. And for vertical bars, you're weaving a basic tabby weave, but with two colors alternating. This color is already still attached from where I did just a straight tabby weave, so I'm going to add my blue on the left. And to do that, I'm just going to tie a simple knot around that first warp thread and push the excess to the back. Now, starting on the right, I'm going to weave with my red thread over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way across. Simple basic tabby weave. And when I get to the other side, I want to twist my red around the blue just slightly. Again, pull it gently, stopping before you pull this and start choking. We don't want to choke our loom. And then what I do is I wrap this around that blue. Just a little twist like that. Just a little twist. And that'll keep my edges. I want to do that every time. That'll keep my edges nice. Now I'm going to weave with the blue yarn in the opposite. See how it's going over and under the opposite weft threads of the red. I'm still doing a tabby weave, just the exact opposite of my red, till I get to the other side, and then I'm going to stop with the blue. And again, I want to make sure that that's twisted around that red so it doesn't skip a warp thread when I weave with the red. And now I'm going to weave with the red. And the red is going to go opposite what the blue is doing, but the exact same as what it did the first time around. So that as I'm weaving, my red will always go over, under, over, under. And my blue will always go under, over, under, over. And again, when I get to the other side, now watch those tails. If you have this doubled up like I do, you don't want to start weaving suddenly with 2 strands of yarn. Just push that down gently. So I want to just twist this around that blue just once, so that when I go back, oops, went the wrong way, so that when I go back with my blue, it twists around the red so that it doesn't skip that first warp thread, because I'm going to go under that warp thread and over. See how my first pass with the blue went under, over, under, over. My red is going over, under, over, under. So I want to do the same exact thing that I did the first time with my blue and going over, under, over, under. And you're just going to keep weaving like this, alternating the blue and the red in rows. And what will happen is it will begin to create stripes in your weaving, red and blue stripes, or what we're calling this weave, vertical bars.